Good afternoon, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to begin our online discussion under the title Wagner Group in Belarus, Lessons to Learn from the Past and New Threats. Although the title is about Wagner in Belarus, but we definitely will take a broader, wider look into Wagner as such, as a military group, its history, as well as any challenges that paramilitary and well subordinated to the highest echelons for the time of being of Russian leadership is acting on regional as well as global grounds. Well, in fact, the Wagner Group appeared first time in 2014, and it's a direct result of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. This hybrid war mean as a group, military group, taking direct part in annexation of Crimea and then in Donbass was a very part of the Russian military strategy. Those so-called polite green men, they become something different with time to come. And by now, in 2023, we see and even seen some different developments with Wagner. For the short period of time, Wagner settled in Belarus under the invitation of Lukashenko, the dictator and authoritarian leader of Belarus. But it didn't last long. It didn't provide, by the way, Wagner with the safe haven. Although some personnel of Wagner still remains in Belarus, how many remains to be discussed. According to some sources, Wagner people even tried to buy some real estate in Belarus as kind of the safe ground for longer periods of time. But it didn't save Wagner leader Prigozhin. He was as we know, was killed in a air catastrophe in Russia. At least we believe he is dead, but nobody knows according to the Russian sources. And then Wagner was back to Russia by the Russian military ministry's orders, become a part of the Russian military force. Now, as reports come, is back to Bakhmut front line. We will see where will be next Wagner action to be followed. But to explain this phenomena and to explain Wagner history as well as actions on a broader scale, with my friend and colleague Hanna Fotyga, member of the European Parliament, we decided to have this online discussion, inviting very distinguished and good speakers to explain our audience about Wagner of today and maybe tomorrow. So we have to follow this because it's a dangerous military formation run by previously by warlord and oligarch of Russian origin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, for the time of being by different commanders and by different political leaders, but it will never, vanish. I mean, it will never be gone. I mean, Wagner might translate itself into something more, into something different, under the different titles, under the different mission, but it will remain as a part of the Russian foreign and defense policy. It must be understood and analyzed carefully in order to avoid any unnecessary provocations from their side, which might come in different regions of the world. So I'm very happy, in cooperation with Hanna Fotyga, we made this online discussion. And after our short presentations, we will go to the main part of our discussion. And I have to inform you that the translation is provided in Lithuanian language as well, which is important for the audience. The questions can be posed in Zoom chat as well as on Facebook in comment section below video. So with this in mind, I invite my colleague Anna Fotyga to make introductory words, and then we go to the main part of our online discussion. Thank you. Anna.
Thank you. Thank you, Petras. Dear colleagues, distinguished panelists, am I heard and is vision okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Distinguished, dear Petras, distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly very difficult to speak after Petras here in the European Parliament in terms of threat from being it Russian Federation, Lukashenko regime, or other threats and challenges that are in particular imposed on us in Central and Eastern Europe, and in particular on Ukraine after a full-scale invasion by Russian Federation. We are like-minded, and we try to be as vocal as possible, helping both our Ukrainian and Belarusian friends. Actually, when we speak about PMCs or Russian PMCs, or because I think that we treat them in general terms as Wagner Group, while they are quite numerous nowadays. After Prigozhin, so-called Prigozhin rebellion, then death of Prigozhin and Utkin, the commander of Wagner Groups, the invitation to Belarus by Alexander Lukashenko raised particular attention and vigilance in our region. I would like only to remind that it is not for the first time we speak about Wagner Group here in the European Parliament. On the contrary, we try to raise the issue in every document dedicated to Russian military or in broader hybrid threats. What we speak now about Wagner Group, the unclear status and presence of Wagner Group, being it Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, even today we hear that they are, part of them is present in vicinity of Bakhmut, that makes it very interesting. We invited outstanding experts. I would like to remind that Samuel Ramani as well and Dmytro Zolotukhin were already present during seminars. Here, I'm sure that other experts also invited by Petras are well known to us. We try to select people who really contribute a lot to this knowledge. I would like particularly to raise your attention to African and Middle East nexus, being it Syria or Africa, because in terms of threats from Belarus, also this nexus is extremely important because of ability to invite so-called refugees. There are migrants organized by Lukashenko regime, probably also with the help of Wagner Group members. But let us listen to our distinguished panelists. Petras, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, we're looking forward for very insightful presentations and then later discussion with our panelists. Let me to introduce as a first speaker Ms. Karen Philippa Larsen. She is from the Global Security and Worldviews Danish Institute for International Studies, located in Copenhagen. And Ms. Larsen is asked, to speak about probably some of the history of the Wagner Group, how it did come up, its use for reaching the aims of the Russian state around the world, because it's a very part of the Russian policy line, and indeed perceptions regarding the group in Russia itself. Not to speak about the possible future of Wagner Group after the assassination of Prigozhin, as we generally believe in. So Ms. Larsen, you are asked to speak up to 7 or 8 minutes generally, and later, of course, we will have a Q&A session. You will be asked to come up once again. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and very important event on the Wagner Group. So in Russian media and official discourse, the Wagner Group is consequently referred to as a PMC, a private military company. So I'm sure we've all heard them talked about in this way. And PMCs have, again, in the official discourse in Russia, gone from being seen as mercenaries, which are illegal in Russia, to, even before the war started in Ukraine, to being largely seen as legitimate actors. So the perception of them has changed in Russia. And we've seen that as the Russian state has used the Wagner Group more and more around the world, the discourse has also changed towards legitimizing the PMCs in general, and hence therefore also the Wagner Group. And this can perhaps also help to explain a little bit why the Wagner Group has been able to play such a large role in Russia's war in Ukraine. On an overall level, so referring to the Wagner Group consequently as a PMC, I would say does at least two things closely linked to why the group was created in the first place. So first of all, it creates an arm's length to this plausible deniability to the Russian state, continuously saying that it's a private entity, right? And it helps to normalize the Wagner Group, at least in a Russian perception, but also on a more on a broader level, since PMCs or PMSCs are currently and has been used by many countries around the world, including European and North American countries. So, however, all of these three words, private, military, and company, are of course quite misleading when we talk about the Wagner Group. And I think, so to start off with the first word, private, so in private military company, I'm not sure I'll talk that much about that, because I think by now it's clear that the Wagner Group is not simply a PMC. I think that's clear to everyone. But the specific relations to the Russian state is still unclear. And this was part of the making of the group, to have a private entity working for the interest of the state without a direct involvement of the state. And it is created, or it was created with inspiration in PMCs of that time. So even Barlow, for example, the founder of the South African PMC, EO, met with the Russian general staff to share his experience in how to create a PMC, so how to privatize security and military operations. But moving on, so to the next word, military, we're talking private military companies, right? I think one thing is also we should be clear about is that the group is not just a military company. I'm sure we'll hear more about this when we hear about how they work, how it has played out in Africa, for example. But the Wagner Group, apart from military and security services, also provides information operation services, helped spread the Kremlin narrative around the world, provides political advisors, diplomatic functions. They have a large resource extraction capability in sort of the network of what we could call the Wagner Group. So importantly, I think the group is not, or the group is, it's not only the more visual element of the military forces. And that's also related to why or how it's created, because it's asymmetric in nature. It's created as a tool of irregular warfare or hybrid warfare to help sort of spread the Russian narratives around the world, the Kremlin narratives around the world, keep Russia-friendly leaders in power, and overall sort of to help counter the hegemony of the United States and of this liberal world order. Also, it's created at the time as a way of countering what the Russian General Staff or the Russian political top saw as the United States using these asymmetrical tools in a part of hybrid warfare. So it's also created to counter threats that was perceived at the time. The last word, talking again about private military company, I would say the group cannot be said to be one single company. It's much more of a network consisting of companies providing all these services that I just mentioned above. So military security, influence operations, and then these natural resource extractions. Because there's a corporate side to the group as well. The economic side of the Wagner Group's operations, we see Prigozhin-linked companies do natural resource extractions in many of the countries where they're present. And I think the size of these operations or the economic benefits of these operations is unknown. However, it is believed that this has given the Wagner Group and Prigozhin a significant income. And this is, of course, also clearly to the benefit of the Kremlin, and a part of why it makes sense in this worldview to create a private military company, because when the Wagner Group provides Russia with political influence around the world at low or no cost for the Kremlin, because they have financed their operation through natural resource extraction, smuggling, other economic activity, producing and selling beer, for example. I mean, this is, of course, a benefit. And I think my last point here in terms of the future of the Wagner Group after the death of Prigozhin, I think this corporate point is also quite interesting to keep in mind, because many of these companies, so everything that we've kind of seen around the military component of the Wagner Group was linked to Yevgeny Prigozhin. And this is where I see that he may be quite difficult to replace. He sort of tied the knot of the strings of all of these different things that the Wagner Group was doing. And I think what we sort of have to keep in mind and to watch for is to wait and see how and if these companies or this network is transferred and to whom. But that, I think, would be one of the challenging things now, because those other services are as important for the group and for Russia as the military service, if we can call it a service, if you know what I mean. Other than that, I think my time is about up, so I'm sure we will discuss more about the future of the group when the other panelists have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin, for your introductory words, and I'm looking forward for continuation of our Q&A. Anna, could you introduce, please, Dmytro Zolotukhin and Samuel Ramani?
Yes.
Later.
Yes.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dmytro Zolotukhin, former deputy minister for information policy of Ukraine. In this capacity, he was here present in the European Parliament during seminar when we raised in broader context the issue of Wagner Group active in Ukraine, in eastern part of Ukraine, perpetration of real atrocities nowadays. Dmytro Zolotukhin is founder of the Institute for Post-Information Society and very outspoken person. So Dmytro, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a huge honor to be present here as an expert, and thank you very much for your unwavering support to Ukraine. I remember this day when I presented, thanks to Hanna Fotyga, I presented the presentation about the crimes of Wagner Group in European Parliament. I've been working on this topic since 2014 and even before, because I have started my career in Ukrainian counterintelligence. I was onto the information topic about the different security issues in the Russian Federation. So thank you very much again, and I want to again to thank you, Karin Philippa Larsen. I know how it's difficult to be a first reporter, but what I would like to start from is from a contradiction, because in my humble opinion, Wagner Group was never and is not a private military company, and we should not regard this organization as a private military company, because it didn't ever had a bank account, a registered number, any kind of legal entity issues, or else. The discussions about the private military companies started in the Russian Federation since 2008, 2010, when there was a very popular narrative about the commitments of the American private military companies in the Middle East. One of them is the big scandal about the Blackwater in Iraq, about this crime against humanity that was committed. I guess it was like 2007 or something, 2008. And there was a narrative that Russian former officers from different special services, from army, they were saying publicly in their social media, we are better warriors than Americans, so why shouldn't we have these kind of organizations all over the world to represent the interests of our country? But the problem with Russian Federation was that everyone wants to have an advantage on this business, because everybody regarded this as a business. So everyone wanted to have a certain influence and to get money by themselves. And everything started to be very active when first these so-called private military companies appeared. For example, this is RSB Group, which was operated in Libya, for example, and with its director Sergei Krenitsyn. Or, for example, Slavonic Corps. Slavonic Corps was registered in Hong Kong, and then they started to publicly say that they are working also in Syria. And first news about the usage of the mercenaries started to come from Syria from about September, October 2013. And after this, all those people who worked in Syria and represented themselves as a part of Slavonic Corps, they were arrested when they get back to Russian Federation, because FSB and other, like special services, they want to have an advantage on this business, and they didn't want to give this business to anyone else. So all those mercenaries, they were arrested. And Dmytro Zolotukhin, aka Wagner, with the call sign Wagner, who was previously one of the officers of GRU, the military intelligence of the Russian Federation, he was among these people who worked previously in Syria. And after this, GRU people who wanted also to benefit from this business, they started to restructure their activity. So instead of putting this in official way, like registering different legal entities, they started to make these cover brands for intelligence activity on the ground. So in the end of the day, the appearance of Wagner Group on the in Crimea and in Ukraine, it was like an covert operations of GRU in Ukraine. And certain sources, they said that Alexei Dumin, who is now the governor of Tula region, who is very close to Putin personally, he was one of the curators, who was one of the coordinators of this activity when he was in the position of the deputy head of GRU, military intelligence of the Russian Federation. And this is how they started in Ukraine. And by this time, Yevgeny Prigozhin was nobody. He was nobody to his death, because he was just a guy who was used to bring cash. So Ministry of Defense gave him tenders to supply food for army, to supply different goods for army. he steal this money. He has stolen a big amount of cash from these procurements, and this cash was used to support the existence of this brand, of this Wagner. And the person who created Wagner was not Prigozhin. It was actually Utkin, because he was an officer, previous officer. Utkin, by the way, he was born in Ukraine, and he had one of his families in Ukraine, and it's very interesting because some parts, some pages of the story still not disclosed. And he created a group of former intelligence officers who started to operate in Lugansk region. And Lugansk region was given to GRU when Donetsk region was given to FSB. So they started to do this. Then Belarus 2020 elections were a situation when Lukashenko feared a lot that Vladimir Putin would destabilize the situation around the Lukashenko's elections. And then when Ukrainian military intelligence provided a special operation of capturing these Wagner fighters, everything went wrong, and Lukashenko firstly arrested those Wagnerists who came to Minsk. And then after GRU people from Russian Federation explained to him the real situation, Lukashenko made the decision to give these people to Russia back with his apologies, and even he asked his older son to follow them, to go with them to the Russian border and to bring them apologies. So after this, well, this was a part of this connection between Lukashenko and Wagner, because he had experience of like apologizing to them and giving them service for the situation that he was not aware that they are the part of the covert operation of Ukrainian military intelligence. In 2022, when the full-scale invasion has started, Prigozhin and mercenaries of Russian Federation, they were not involved in the invasion. And only after like 1 or 2 months of unsuccessful invasion, Prigozhin, again with GRU people, they made sure that they started to participate. And of course, Bakhmut, the operations around Bakhmut, they have become a central part of their story. And in my humble opinion, Bakhmut is the repetition of what we witnessed in Syrian Palmyra. If you remember, Syrian Palmyra was captured 2 times. And in my humble opinion, it happened because when Palmyra was captured first time, Shoigu, Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, he used the situation to report to Putin himself, firstly, to get the benefit for capturing Palmyra. But the capturing Palmyra was made by Wagner guys, was made by Prigozhin guys. And Prigozhin was very upset that Shoigu got all the benefits, political benefits from Putin. And in my humble opinion, again, I cannot confirm or deny this by facts, but in my humble opinion, Wagner people, they left Palmyra and said to Shoigu, if you're saying that you captured Palmyra, so show us how do you do this. And they started to recapture it another time. So in my humble opinion, Bakhmut was the repetition of it. Prigozhin made a commitment, maybe to Putin himself, maybe to certain his friends, that he will retake Bakhmut. And he has spent a year of trying to do this, and it was very unsuccessful. And because of this absence of success, a huge clash between him and Shoigu has started. And this clash led him to this open attack against Putin himself. And after this, well, Putin made a decision to assassinate him. In my humble opinion, what is left after the Prigozhin's assassination is the main asset of Wagner Group is everything what's going on in Africa. Because unfortunately, I have to admit that Yevgeny Prigozhin had a very interesting criminal talent. how to build a network of businesses, not only military businesses, but also mining business, drug dealing, and people's trafficking, and so on and so forth. And because of this criminal tendency, he created a networks. And now there is a clash. Who will benefit? Who will get the legacy of Prigozhin in Africa? As for Belarus, I think that everything what is going on now in information provocations, for example, in Poland, in Lithuania, you know, all these pictures with the chevrons of Wagner presented in different locations. It's all being done by the Russian military intelligence, by the GRU. I don't think that Wagner somehow connected with this, because they use Wagner as a brand, as not as a company, but as a word, as a brand, because it's scary, it's famous, it's to a certain extent sexy for media, and so on and so forth. But the main legacy is in Africa. And I regret a lot that, you know, the European Union had this military operation called Barkhane. Barkhane was an operation held in Mali with French militaries, and it was anti-terroristic operation. And unfortunately, we have to admit that the anti-terroristic activity of the European Union in Africa has failed. And it is not because of the you know, responsibility of France or European Union. It's just because we underestimated the level of the terroristic threat in Africa. And ending up with my speech, sorry for taking your time, I want to say that if you go to GPT, to ChatGPT, and ask ChatGPT, the artificial intellect, what are the similarities between the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Wagner Group, ChatGPT will present you at least 4 or 5 similarities, which I will not repeat. I will leave it to you, because it's very interesting how to talk with ChatGPT, but it will definitely present you similarities between the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Wagner Group. And on the base of these answers of the ChatGPT, in my humble opinion, we have to work mutually. We have to work in connection how to bring the decision for European Parliament and the European Commission of designation of the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization, as Lithuanian government already and Lithuanian parliament already did. And I thank to Petras Auštrevičius, I want to express my gratitude for this leadership Lithuania has shown to us. I will stop on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this very interesting presentation. Now let me introduce our third distinguished speaker, also quite familiar to European Parliament, to members and the staff because of presence, in particular on situation in Africa. I was able to host one of these seminars. Let me present a distinguished expert of the British RUSI think tank, important, well known to all of us, Mr. Samuel Ramani, Dr. Samuel Ramani. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna, and it's been a great session so far. So, yes, I just wanted to, in the next 5 to 7 minutes, just kind of encapsulate. My brief was about Wagner's future in Africa, and I wanted to kind of tie it also to some of the things we've just heard. So, obviously, after the Prigozhin mutiny in June of 2023, it seemed as if there were 2 major vectors of the Wagner Group's presence. Obviously, there was the Belarusian vector, which was developing through the construction of field camps, as well as the vector globally, in particular, did their operations in Africa. And those were the 2 areas that were deemed to be most likely to be areas where the Wagner Group could act autonomously from the Russian state to some degree, because in Ukraine, if they ever were to go back on the front lines, they most likely would be much more regulated. And in Syria, we already saw some early signs of the state trying to rein in the Wagner Group forces very tightly, from denying them access to bases like TS and Khmeimim, to the arrests that occurred during the hours after the Wagner mutiny and detention of some key figures, to an ultimatum that was passed against them to leave by September, cutting off of phone communications between them and the people participating in the mutiny in Rostov, various other things. So it seemed as if they were trying to get control over Ukraine and Syria, but in Belarus and in Africa, Wagner was going to be able to, in some extent, exist as a relatively independent brand and project its own influence. And I think that's largely maintained, has largely remained intact with regards to Africa. When you look at the latest U.S. intelligence assessment of what we're seeing with regards to Wagner Group's activities in Africa, we see two striking conclusions. The first is that there is no significant drawdown of forces that has been witnessed since the Wagner Group mutiny and also Prigozhin's death. So things have been relatively static, and remarkably so. And the second thing is that there really hasn't been significant progress so far towards integrating the Wagner Group operations in Africa with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the second is really quite striking because ever since the Wagner mutiny, we've seen a series of diplomatic trips that were conducted by the head of Ingushetia, the former head, the Deputy Defense Minister, Yunus Bekiakurov, specifically aimed at reaching out to Wagner's clients and trying to include them and integrate them within the broader Russian security umbrella. How we've even seen some alleged interventions by Putin himself on this point of view. For example, there was some reporting on or around the July 2023 Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg that Putin personally instructed Tutor not to meet with Prigozhin at that summit and only sent one of his deputies to meet with Prigozhin at the Trezin Hotel. That's why there was that photo that was taken with him in a t-shirt and jeans with one of his deputies and not with Tutor himself. But that doesn't seem to have led to the broader integration of Wagner's architecture in Africa under Russian state control just yet. And I think that there's several reasons for this. I think it'd be useful to walk through country by country, maybe, what some of the main problems are. So Wagner's four core theaters of operation are Libya, Sudan, Mali, and Central African Republic. Those are the four most important ones in Africa. In Libya, I think there would be significant appetite for the Wagner Group to be under the control of the state to some degree, at least on Khalifa Haftar's side, because Khalifa Haftar had a fractious relationship with Prigozhin during the last few years. He was, for example, Prigozhin was very suspicious of Haftar's links towards France, and Prigozhin was also very suspicious of Haftar retaining U.S. citizenship. Haftar, in turn, was frustrated by the fact that Prigozhin had seemingly backed Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's political ambitions in 2020, right when his offensive on Tripoli was floundering and Turkey was gaining ground against the government of national accord. And Haftar also was frustrated by just the sheer level of control that the Wagner Group had in some installations in Benghazi and Tobruk, even in some base camps, and some air bases and some facilities. The LNA officials themselves on their own territory had to ask Wagner Group people for permission just to come in and out. So they had to get entry and exit permits from the Wagner Group. So that degree of control by a non-state actor that is it was quite unnerving for Haftar. So Haftar has been very receptive to Yevkurov's two visits to Benghazi. One of them was about flood relief to Derna. The other was about counterterrorism partnerships with the Russian state. And he now has gone to Moscow just yesterday, as we saw, and he's reportedly offering potentially Russian warships to have access to a Mediterranean port in Benghazi and Tobruk. At least that's what the Americans think might be happening. But the Russians can't really fully integrate the 2,000 PMCs that Wagner has in eastern Libya under the umbrella just yet, because the Russian state does not want to take full control over these operations with the LNA. The Russians also want to maintain close ties with the authorities in Tripoli, and they don't want to have another reopening and reheating of the conflict with Turkey in Libya, like we saw in a hot phase in 2019 and 2020, and does not want to be seen as backing Haftar's continued expansionist ambitions. Haftar continues to talk about pushing westward from time to time and continues to threaten the existing status quo and the ceasefire in Libya. So therefore, the Russian state has got to keep Wagner to some degree autonomous, even though the state obviously wants to rein them in, and Haftar also wants to rein them in. So that's just an example of how difficult this might be. In Central African Republic, we're seeing a situation where the president also is much like Haftar. Tutor is very keen to see the Wagner Group be placed under state control because of the just sheer extent to which the Wagner Group has infiltrated every area of society. I mean, they run post offices, they run, they serve as bodyguards to the president, they conduct massacres in Agbabo with some elements of the Central African Republic Armed Forces, and often do operations without even much consultation with the Central African authorities in critical areas like the borders with Chad and Cameroon and Sudan. But they've effectively, at this point, gained so much leverage and so much degree of infiltration that they can they've almost captured the state. And it's interesting to see that Tutor emphasizes in public that we've got a deal with Russia that was signed in August of 2018, and his advisor says if we don't have Wagner's, we'll get Mozart's and Beethoven's. But in practice, they really can't dislodge the existing architecture because it's just so integrated. And that's a significant concern that we're seeing over there. In Sudan, it's a similar challenge because on the one hand, the Russian state and the Russian foreign ministry and defense ministry didn't approve of Prigozhin's close ties with Hemeti. But on the other hand, they need the gold that Hemeti is providing for hard currency to finance their operations and to smuggle that gold into the central bank during a period of sanctions. So they can't really burn their bridges there entirely. And they also want to maintain a Red Sea base with Burhan. So perhaps it's better to have a deniable force like Wagner dealing with Hemeti if you don't want to burn your bridges with Burhan and you need the gold and you don't necessarily get along with a warlord like Hemeti. It's better to have a somewhat autonomous force there that's happening. The one place where that trend seems to be different is in Mali. And I think that's quite an interesting one. In the other cases, I think the Wagner Group is going to remain largely autonomous. The problem was in Mali, since August or September of 2022, there's actually been a decline in the amount of heavy equipment and the decline in amount of weaponry beyond ammunition that's been delivered to the Wagner forces there. And that, in addition to the fact that they were unprepared for the mission, probably explains why they only engaged in one conflict with ISIS that whole time. ISIS's reach has doubled over the past year, and they've had limited and pretty disastrous altercations with the JNIM rebel forces over there. Mali might be one area where the forces are coming under the state umbrella, the 1,000 PMCs that are there, and they're also starting to get access to more hardware and more equipment. On August 15th, it was being widely reported that there was an expansion of Russian base presences and Russian military deployments there. So Mali might be the one outlier, but in general, Russia's finding a hard time keeping the lid on Wagner post-Prigozhin. In the longer term, obviously, there might be possibilities. It's very likely that the Ministry of Defense may not actually be the main architect in creating a replacement PMC to Wagner, but instead that responsibility may go back to the GRU because GRU created Wagner in the first place. It's possible that the GRU might empower an organization like Redoubt to start recruiting more in Africa, perhaps tie it to another oligarch like Gennady Timchenko, so it's got tighter state control, but still that veneer of deniability. But that's a longer-term process, and that will take a long time. And when you look at the Russian Telegram channels and Russian expert commentaries, they all seem to predict that a fast drawdown or a fast replacement of Wagner's operations would be disastrous for our influence. We might be able to pull it off in Syria. We can't pull it off in Africa. So I think that really what we're going to be seeing, in spite of all this turmoil over the past few months, my main overarching point is more of the same. And that's not something that the African clients want or the Russian state wants, but that's unfortunately probably what they're going to consign to have. Finally, one last point. I think that if there's one silver lining in this, the Wagner Group's ability to expand to new theaters has probably been complicated by some of the events in recent time. It was telling that even before this, Burkina Faso, in spite of all of its close ties with Moscow and its isolation from France, was not willing to do more than just renew a Norgold contract that was there from 2010 or deploy instructors for training purposes. It wasn't actually willing to bring Wagner in. Now I think that's probably less likely to happen in the near term. In Niger also, there's the risk of Russia combating with Nigeria and ECOWAS, where it's got significant economic interest, so it may not want to go in. The one silver lining, I think, is that Wagner may not expand very much, but in the countries where it will continue to brutalize civilian populations, it'll continue to support autocracy, and continue to use Africa's resources to fund its illegal war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Dr. Ramani. Thank you, Samuel, for this presentation. Petras, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Colleagues, let me to introduce Hanna Liubakova. She's a freelance journalist and researcher from Belarus, and indeed she is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And obviously, we will ask Anna to disclose probably more a part of the Wagner's history, what comes to Belarus, connections, and any risks and it poses for Belarus and Belarusians in general. Hanna, floor is yours.
Thank you, Petras, and thank you everyone for joining. I will speak about some consequences for Lukashenko regime and his system, Wagner presence in Belarus and the Belarusian people. So we all might remember how 3 months ago, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko all of a sudden became this negotiator-in-chief, this mediation party to the Kremlin and Prigozhin conflict. Lukashenko even extended security guarantees to Yevgeny Prigozhin. He said that he convinced Putin not to destroy Wagner Group and his chief. Lukashenko emphasized his huge role in stopping the Wagner mutiny. He said that Prigozhin was basically not answering phone calls, and he only wanted to speak with Lukashenko. Several times, by the way. And after that, Lukashenko also vividly described how he personally averted a civil war in Russia, and basically he saved Russian people. So he enjoyed, I think, this 5 minutes of fame that he got out of this mutiny. But I think at this point, it's already clear that Lukashenko's entire narrative and predictions about the future and the destiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner Group became inaccurate. What is now visible is that Lukashenko is no longer attuned and aligned with the Kremlin's decisions. He simply doesn't know what Putin thinks anymore. And he's not an expert. He's no longer an expert in the Kremlin, Kremlinology, I think this is how it's called. This is the image that Lukashenko has been trying to sell for years, and it, of course, now clear for Belarusian experts that Lukashenko has only gained losses out of this sort of political capital that he invested in this Wagner saga. What is clear, the Kremlin has its own idea of deals, especially deals with traitors. If the Kremlin wants, for the sake of tactical interest and without bloodshed, neutralize opponents or, well, mercenaries in this case, the Kremlin will involve Lukashenko and this newly built base near the in the Osipovich region. Tomorrow, if the Kremlin wants to destroy the head of the Wagner Group, Lukashenko's opinion and his agreements, apparently, with Prigozhin will not even interest anyone in the Kremlin. So I think this is one of the most important consequences and sort of aspect that we should remember out of this kind of deal that apparently, allegedly, Lukashenko was able to broker. So in this context, let's also consider the next portion of Lukashenko's agreements and statements that he made when he recently said, after Prigozhin's death and the plane crash, that Wagner is alive and will live in Belarus, numbering even up to 10,000 individuals who would train the Belarusian military. We should bear in mind that these were the words of someone who is not in charge of who is not sort of in charge of the destiny of the Wagner Group at all, and who is detached from any decision making regarding the future of Wagner. Their presence, the presence of Wagner mercenaries in Belarus was needed, firstly, due to the sort of resolve kind of all this issue, of course, and due to the fact that Prigozhin was struggling to secure the future in employment, I'd say, for his mercenaries. He was in the process of sort of seeking where they can go. Some of the mercenaries had already taken leave, and that was stated officially by Putin, and I think Lukashenko also mentioned that. But also in August, even before the death of Prigozhin, the base, this kind of camp of Wagner in the village Tsel in the Osipovich region had shrunk by almost a third. So there was already a process of diminishing their presence in Belarus, again, even before Prigozhin's death. So we might assume that this dynamic might continue. Because, well, Lukashenko said that the Wagner Group will keep sort of existing in Belarus at their own expense. And now with the lack of like bosses who will rule over them in Belarus, so that's the main question. I think it's already been almost 5 minutes, but I already mentioned a few points, if I may, okay, if we still have time.
Yes, Hanna, go ahead.
Sure, because I think there are several other important aspects that I would like to mention. So the initial presence of Wagner mercenaries was, of course, a manifestation of Lukashenko's effort to showcase his huge loyalty for Putin, and kind of as a mean of project. He wanted to help Putin to intimidate neighbors, Western countries, and Ukraine. This is something that Putin would like and wanted to see, and Lukashenko just played this role very skillfully, as he always does. And this dynamic of Kremlin influence in Belarus is not only limited to Wagner presence. This is also the story of the presence of the Russian troops, which is also, by the way, had shrunk. According to the Ukrainian military sources, there are now around 1,000 Russian troops in Belarus. Another aspect is, of course, nuclear Russian nukes, which we also are not really... it was confirmed and hasn't been confirmed, so there are many questions about that, but this is all done to destabilize, to provoke, to pose threats to the continent, to allies, and to Ukraine, of course, here. And the departure, regarding the Belarusian people and the moods, as we know, they are not, people in Belarus did not support the presence of Wagner mercenaries. This is what propaganda acknowledged itself. They actually wrote about this in one of the Telegram channels. And of course, the Belarusian society does not support the presence of Russian nukes in Belarus. It was clear that they were not happy, but at the same time, of course, the departure of Wagner mercenaries they would perceive it positively, but at the same time, I think such developments also show to people that first, Lukashenko makes decisions despite the will of Belarusians, which is not surprising, of course, but B, is that Lukashenko is not in the full control, because this is something, this pattern of Wagner presence in Belarus and kind of all these sort of developments that happen after that shows that it's up to Moscow to decide whether they would stay, whether they would leave, whether they would travel there in the first place, and how this whole situation will look like, and what will happen to Prigozhin, despite all Lukashenko's security guarantees. This will of course, have influence and impact on people, on society, but also on those people inside the Belarusian system who support Lukashenko, not because of ideology or because they believe in Putin or whatever, but because they're just opportunists and they want to have access to resources and power. And this is why they support Lukashenko. So this kind of weakened position of Lukashenko will definitely something that will be something that will demotivate them. We don't know how this will explode in the future yet, but this is definitely something that they will have to keep in mind, because this is a sign of sort of destabilization and weakening of Lukashenko. And another, really quickly, the third aspect is that Lukashenko really had this ambition to play in the Russian political field. He wanted to see Putin as a weaker ruler, and this is how Lukashenko sort of tried to present himself as someone who is, who was this wise politician who was able to calm down these two gentlemen. But this is the end of, the death of Prigozhin, despite, again, all the security guarantees, shows that Lukashenko kind of is not, doesn't have any political weight and doesn't have any influence over Putin. And this, again, will definitely have impact on Lukashenko's elites inside the country, because they see that, Russia is a mafia state, it's just not controllable, it's not stable. And the fact that Lukashenko put all the baskets, all the eggs in the same basket, and sort of focused on Russia for its support, for its survival, for his survival, shows to the elites that Lukashenko will be weaker in the future as well. So I think it will definitely sort of provoke some moods inside the system that, whether we should support Lukashenko or not. I'll stop here and let's discuss the rest during the discussion.
Thank you, Hanna. Thank you for your intervention. Colleagues, now we have a good 30 minutes for Q&A session. I invite everybody to be active and to present comments or any questions you have to our great speakers. And may I start from Karen? Karen, you mentioned deniability from the Russian side what comes to association with Wagner. And by certain periods of time, indeed, Kremlin was rather lucky in this kind of process, but not any longer. We see the Russian GRU or militaries taking over some operations in Africa, more kind of the associations with Wagner. What kind of impact it made or makes on the Russian image worldwide? I mean, you see any damage for the Russian let's say image as a state, this association, growing and indeed undeniable association with Wagner Group?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I think perhaps, well, the answer is of course not an easy one. However, I would say that yes, on the one side, of course, this plausible deniability is becoming completely implausible, right? It's not really possible anymore to deny the connections or the links, and I think that's also what we are seeing with events like this, and also the steps that has been taken from many states around the world to condemn the Wagner Group. And Russia's use of the group. On the other hand, I also think, at least in some parts of where the group is active, I think we can also see sort of perhaps this sort of a perception of the group as a private military company. And I just want to make clear, Dmytro, because you started out saying that we had a contradiction in how we see the group, that I wasn't arguing for the group as being a private military company, not at all. I was simply saying that that's sort of how the Kremlin would like it to be perceived. So just to make that clear. And I think some places, perhaps this perception of the group as contractors or so, it's less important. So the links to the Kremlin or to the Russian state, they are less important. So a colleague of mine, for example, did the field work in Mali, where one of the answers that she got when she tried to ask about, so these are Russian contractors, right? It's like, yeah, contractors, so what? Everybody's got a contract somewhere. And there's not really seen a difference between being a private army force or a national army force. So, I mean, that's also part of the picture. I think we have to remember that for some, it's actually not that important what the connection is, whether or not there is a connection to the Kremlin. But I would say, yes, the most important part about this plausible deniability, completely being implausible by now, is of course that that steps are being taken towards condemning the group, legalizing the group, and so forth. Yes.
Thank you, Karen. May I ask Dmytro? Dmytro, it's clear that Wagner sustained big losses. I mean, fighting around Bakhmut and in other parts of the on the Ukrainian front, and Wagner was indeed fed by recruitments made by Prigozhin himself and his team in many prisons on the Russian territory. Is it possible any longer that Wagner will be recruiting, or how you would describe the situation? I mean, will they have any chance, I mean, to your mind, to recruit convicts from the Russian prisons, who are very numerous, I have to admit? I mean, potentially it's a huge, group of people who might be recruited to any military groups in Russia. But how about Wagner? And if not, so how the numbers of Wagner will look like? I mean, having in mind all the restrictions put under by Kremlin. Dmytro.
Thank you for the question. Well, I would like to start from the issue that there is no chance that Yevgeny Prigozhin could do the recruitment of convicts in Russian jails without the personal permission of the President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. This is just impossible neither technically nor logically in terms of this huge gang which is being called the Russian government. Secondly, it also should be mentioned that really Prigozhin was a rather significant person. He spent himself 10 years in jail. He knows this audience. He really had this, I don't know how to say, this vibe, how to be connected with the convicts and how to talk to them. And regarding all these features, for me, it is much less possible now that someone would replace Prigozhin himself. Secondly, I think that, well, this is absolutely direct violation of any I don't know, any human rights, any laws, any possible norms to do this with the convicts. And then, well, Ukrainian army and Ukrainian special services have multiple proofs of the violation of the human rights of these convicts because they were killed massively. They were drugged massively because all those drug addicts that stayed in jails, they came to the front line, but the fact that they came to the front line doesn't mean that they stopped to do drugs. So of course they were supplied with drugs. So in my humble opinion, they had this moment of glory by getting any kind of permissions from Vladimir Putin personally to present the result. For now, I think that there would be some balance. Firstly, Putin already understood that by giving so much of possibilities to someone and, you know, like making someone so strong as he does with Prigozhin, it makes the vulnerability for himself. So I think that he will now think twice of making these opportunities. On the other hand, brand of Wagner remains, well, in my humble opinion, in terms of mobilization, in terms of recruitment, the most valuable thing is the brand of Wagner Group, because none of the new organizations, numerous organizations that were created in 2022, and these kind of military, paramilitary groups of Gazprom, and connected with Timchenko personally, Gennady Timchenko, one of the oligarchs, they're not so popular. They do not have any kind of neither experience nor reputation among the public, even among those people who are eager to go to fight to the front in Ukraine. So in my humble opinion, the curious part of this question is whether GRU or anyone else like Timchenko or any other oligarch will continue to have the right to use Wagner Group as a brand for recruitment of other people. And if they will be allowed to use the brand, I wouldn't say that they will use this administrative tool to go to jails. I think they will use money. They will use high salaries to invite people to be recruited to Wagner as a brand. And then under this brand, they might go even to the contract with MOD maybe, or maybe to some private paramilitary organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro. Samuel, you rightly mentioned about the still ongoing Wagner activities in Africa, but once looking at this business, so-called business part of the Wagner operations, which is indispensable, which is so important, I mean, financially for Wagner and its leadership in particular. How about the so-called Wagner business? Is there any tendency for change? I mean, are they, you know, switching to new sectors of mining or any other businesses in so-called businesses in Africa? Or, I mean, what they had before, they have now, and probably they will continue. Samuel.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Wagner Group's business interests in Africa are already quite varied, though they're obviously largely concentrated in the mining sector, especially when you're looking at CAR and Sudan, and oil, of course, in Libya. But even in CAR, they also were quite involved, for example, in the forestry sector. Like a lot of the logging operations were actually being done by Wagner PMCs as well. It wasn't just the much more popular focus on gold and diamonds, because that just reflects the amount of infiltration that they have. So I think that right now, I think that the Russians are really trying to figure out exactly what to do with Wagner's business operations, because on the one hand, they know that that's a source of independent financing and wealth for a group that may not necessarily be loyal to the Kremlin. But on the other hand, they don't know exactly how to dismantle them, and they don't want necessarily dismantle them because they bring hard currency to the country. And they also want to try to see if they can kind of court the people who are working there to see if those people know anything that Prigozhin may have known or Chekolov may have known about sanctions violations. Right? Chekolov was especially important in running these logistics in these businesses. Utkin was more of a front man, whereas Chekolov was actually somebody who was involved in the day-to-day negotiations and had movements over here. Maybe some of those personal connections were always kept under Prigozhin's hat, but maybe some of the people who are at the mid-level and at the higher levels who are still operating there might know that. So they want to kind of court them and bring them in. There's also obviously some risks associated with that, but trying to forcibly nationalize these businesses too. I think what we're seeing a lot of people talking about in Syria, for example, on Russian Telegram channels, is that if they put too much pressure on them, the Wagner forces might just flee and they might just hand over their assets to Iran. They don't necessarily trust what these people might do with these assets. So that's something that's quite significant as well. And whereas in Syria, they have the ability of other rival oligarchs like Timchenko has already managed to take over certain accesses into the gas sector. Everpolis, for example, is a large company. We don't know what's going to happen with that. There's similarly large entities inside Africa, which are quite unpredictable. The one operation where I think the state might have the easiest success is Sudan, because Mero Gold, when it took over those reserves, Prigozhin was with Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev was there as some kind of a co-guarantor and a co-signatory, which suggests that the Kremlin was directly engaging with Sudan's Ministry of Natural Resources under Bashir at the time, and has actively been involved in carrying out those operations. But elsewhere in CAR and Libya and Mali, it's really Wagner Group owning it, and they're concerned. They want to court them and the people who are there to learn their know-how about sanctions violations, but they push them too hard, they might go rogue and just give up valuable assets. So right now, I just don't think they really have a clear strategy of what they're going to do with the assets that Wagner holds.
Thank you, Samuel. And then the question, I mean, to Hanna. Hanna, would you please explain us, I mean, more from a reaction of the average Belarusians, especially those who live around those villages, so to say, given to Wagner mercenaries to settle. I heard there have been some daily crimes, even some crimes of higher level against local population. What was the take of, and was any discussion, I mean, you could track down in social media among Belarusians once seeing Wagner mercenaries and probably family members of Wagner mercenaries going around?
My honest answer would be that we don't really have the full picture because we don't have such sociology research yet. I mean, it's very difficult to organize it, very difficult to have at the moment. In Russia, Levada Center published, I think, almost immediately after the mutiny, the approval rating of Prigozhin, of Putin, of, I think, others, right, in Russia. So we don't have such things in Belarus at the moment, but when I spoke in the beginning immediately to people who are not necessarily anti-Lukashenko, who live inside the country, they mentioned that while Wagner has this reputation of being rapists, criminals, and so on, so they were not happy about their presence, which was quite clear. And I already mentioned that propaganda reacted to this immediately. They even wrote that the image of Wagner Group and Prigozhin himself should change because they're not that bad, really. And they also mentioned that large part of the population perceived the news of the presence. Well, at that moment it was still a potential presence. I mean, they didn't move at that moment, so the large part of the population of Belarusians perceived the news very negatively. So that was a quote. Most recently, there was this news about a man in Belarus who was arrested because he commented, like he took a video of one of the Wagner mercenaries in Belarus, and apparently, allegedly, by this is what the security forces forced him to say, that he insulted this Wagner mercenary. So he was arrested. We don't know the fate of this man yet, but he might be accused of whatever, right? So this is clearly a politically motivated case. Again, for many Belarusians, their presence is not justified. Why are they there? For what reason? As I mentioned, right, I think many people just now understand that Lukashenko is not really in control of many things in Belarus, which was not, I think, clear for them years ago. But he does not control the movement of Russian troops. He does not control the movement of Wagner mercenaries in Belarus. He does not control their number or their sort of presence and so on. And he's voiced threats, you might remember, of potential excursions to Warsaw and Rzeszów that he sort of said a while ago. His agreements with Prigozhin, his desire to project himself as a significant player in the region and in domestic Russian politics are, of course, very interesting to discuss for us analysts, but they don't really have any indirect connection with the decisions made in Moscow. And that becomes more and more clear, not only for us here, but also for people inside the country and for the elites, which is very important.
Excellent. Thank you, Hanna, very much. Look, I received some questions, as well as one request for intervention. It will come at a later stage. Now I want to give a floor and be back to Anna Fotyga. Anna.
Thank you, Petras. Actually, I have several questions. Maybe my first goes to Mrs. Larsen and refers to putting both Russian political elites, political and military elites before justice, but also perpetrators of war crimes for this in Ukraine. Is current status of Wagner Group possibility to dilute the question by Russian Federation, and what should we do now to ensure that this path, both for crime of aggression, that is, although difficult from my point of view, it is more clear. But I think that it is absolutely necessary, therefore, to link Wagner Group to Russian policies and make it very firm, in order also to make it clear that no impunity after the war. So my first question is like this. I have other questions, Petras, as well. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Anna, maybe you can ask another one, indicating to whom.
Okay. Therefore, second and very short is to Samuel Ramani. Is there any Wagner Group link in recent developments in Niger? Do you see it eventually? And maybe some additional question to you. Do you think that Wagner Group's presence in Africa may be a contribution to Lukashenko and his sons' actions in pushing so-called migrants from Africa to borders of both Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, other countries? And my next is to Dmytro Zolotukhin. Well, thank you for mentioning ChatGPT, at least in fourth iteration of this AI tool. There is Polish large contribution as well, but I still value human intelligence, actually. And that intelligence tells me that in spite of similarities between revolutionary guards and Wagner groups, there are also differences. Actually, yes, I agree with Hanna that Russia is a mafia state, but for many years already, I try to indicate that it is also state perpetrating terrorist acts, although and responsible for this, instigating it. And Wagner Group is not as big and as almighty as Revolutionary Guard in Iran, actually. So I would like to indicate the very vicious role of Russian Federation all over the world, and Wagner groups are just one of many tools used by Russia to do this, and not the biggest one, surely. There is whole state doing this, in my opinion. Do you agree with this? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And may we start from Karen, then Dmytro, Samuel, and if Hanna wants to submit some answers as well. Karen.
Yes, thank you for that question. So in terms of bringing the Wagner Group or members of the Wagner Group to justice, as I understand the question, and will that be possible? I think we see now that work is being put into this around the world, and this might be an obvious thing to say, but I think we should expect this to be done outside of Russia, because we have obviously seen like no legal justice being taken towards members of the group inside of Russia, despite, and I think in terms of will it be possible, I mean, there are pretty well covered incidents of human rights violations and evil, brutal killings done by members of the group around the world that are by now pretty well covered, I would say. However, I'm not a lawyer or practice law in any way, so I don't know if it's possible, but I would say that at least material is there to sort of do something like this. I don't know, maybe some of the other panelists knows more about what it would take to do this in justice systems around the world, but I mean, in terms of whether this can be, I mean, whether we have the proof of what the group is doing and the way that the group is functioning, and also, as I said, really the brutal the methods of the group around the world, I think that has been covered quite significantly.
Thank you, Karen. Dmytro?
Thank you very much for a very good and constructive question. Let me put it this way. I would like to connect the answer to this question to the issue of the punishing the crimes of Wagner. And in my humble opinion, to combat the phenomena which we dislike, which is the activity of Wagner Group, first we have to give it a name. In my humble opinion, there are different angles and different strategies how to punish the crimes of the Russian Federation in the world committed with the violence and military means. And these are the crimes of aggression, the violation of human rights, the genocide, which is, by the way, lately was a huge hype around this issue in Ukraine, because the commission that came here to Ukraine said that we do not see enough of evidences how to document the crime of the genocide, which is also very sensitive issue. But in my humble opinion, we have to understand our capabilities of how to bring to justice and how to bring to account Russian Federation in the most successful and the most effective way. And thinking about how to do this in the most effective way, I know that European Parliament made a decision to designate Russian Federation as the state sponsor of terrorism, but the state sponsor of terrorism should sponsor someone. So it should be the subject who is doing what he's got from what he's getting the sponsorship. And second issue that I want to underline, that the violent activity and the military activity of the Wagner Group is not only even the part of the, is not only the half of the activity of Wagner Group. In my humble opinion, this ecosystem that was built in Russian Federation was made specifically to spread hatred, fear, and the violent, the aggressive content in the media, because they now really in the Telegram channels, they themselves, they publish small issues about that they really have this big problem with what they call ultra patriots. So those people who are so kind of patriotic that they need to attack Vladimir Putin himself, that he is not cruel enough to other nations, to other people, he is not using enough of violence, he's not using his nuclear warheads and so on and so forth. So they call these people ultra patriots. And we see how those ultra patriots, they're being punished by the Russian regime itself. First is Prigozhin, then it's Girkin, who is now prosecuted in jail and even beaten. Then it's the story, the latest story about Ramzan Kadyrov and his 15 years old son, who deliberately beaten the arrested guy who is 19 years old in a jail, and do it without any fear of punishment or whatever. So in my humble opinion, all these activities, they are connected first with the fear, the feeling of fear of the violence from the state, and second, built on the media impact. And in my humble opinion, all these issues, fear as a base of communication, huge media network, how to spread fear among Russian citizens and among citizens of other countries, including members of the European Parliament, because I heard from my fellow colleagues that some of the members of the European Parliament are really concerned about their security after all these hammers sent all over the Europe. And then it's the connection with the Russian government through the GRU, through the military intelligence, and connection directly to Putin. All these three issues are telling me that this hatred and this fear is the part of the bigger phenomena, which we used to call terrorism, and connected with our abilities, how to punish Russian Federation for these crimes. In my humble opinion, this path, how to use the logic of designation of terrorist organization, designation of the state sponsors of terrorism, this is the one of the effective ways, in my humble opinion, how to bring to account the state actors who are who be confident they are into it, they are controlling this, and this is why I mentioned, I used the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a tool, as an example, because let me just say one more thing. The United States of America, they designated Wagner Group as the transnational criminal organization instead of designating this as a terrorist organization. I totally understand the political logic behind this decision. I totally understand that they cannot talk or not talk with Russian Federation under the context of the terroristic activity, because they will shut down these undercover channels, how to negotiate and make the diplomatic connections with them. But on the other hand, I tried to explain to my fellow colleagues here in Ukraine what is the difference between the designation of the transnational criminal organization and terrorist organization. United States have two lists. One list is terrorist organization, and you can have Al-Qaeda and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in it. And another list is transnational criminal organization, which is for example, Yakuza or some kind of drug dealers from the South America. And my question
Dmytro,
is very
can I
simple.
ask you to be as short as possible?
Yeah, last question. Have you ever heard that United States of America used their missile strike against Yakuza? I guess not. And this is the difference between the designation of terrorist and criminal organization. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dmytro. Samuel, can you be as brief as possible, please?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in response to the two questions that Anna posed, with regards to the Wagner Group's entry into Niger, I mean, obviously, even before the coup that we saw in July of 2023, there were a lot of efforts from Russian information outlets, particularly those of the French language variety, to sow discord and discontent inside Niger. I think the trigger was Mohamed Bazoum's legislation early in 2022, I think it was April 2022, which basically allowed for foreign force and European deployments. So Russian propaganda started aligning and amplifying the views of groups like M62, the civil society group that threatened to hold the Western and European diplomats hostage in Niger, and basically fanned the flames of a lot of unrest by proclaiming that Russia could fight terrorism in Niger more effectively than the French could, pointing to Syria, pointing to Central African Republic, and also claiming that the French were plundering Niger's uranium reserves, which was a key element of Tchiani and the Niger junta's rhetoric. So certainly Russian propagandists and Russian state media, Wagner-aligned political operatives primed public opinion in the direction that was favorable to the junta and against France, but I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that they actually were involved in the orchestration or in the implementation of the coup. Moreover, I have doubts, as I said earlier, about whether Russia would want to have a potential conflict with ECOWAS and how far they'll go. When I look at Russian media commentaries about Niger, aside from some of the hardliners, like Dugin and Prigozhin's acolytes who are liking this, more of the mainstream ones are talking about the fact that Russia really doesn't have much to offer Niger economically, and it's unclear whether the Nigerian military can even use Russian air defense systems and Russian technology. So I wouldn't go too far as to say that Russia was behind it, but I think that they did prime the opinion in the junta's direction through their information warfare. And that's why Wagner's political interference tools remain extremely important to watch, even though Prigozhin's main media outlets like Riafan and others have been shut. With regards to Lukashenko and migration, I think certainly there is an effort, obviously, from the Russians to support any kind of weaponization of migration against countries in NATO. I think certainly Latvia has been very concerned about this threat and its possibilities. And we need to be looking further afield than just Iraq and Syria. We should also be looking for the instability in Africa. The collapse of the potential migration pact between Niger and the Europeans, which helped rein in migration, and in Mauritania, which is also getting closer ties with Europe, can't fill that void, then I think that there could be a significant problem going forward. But I haven't seen much evidence yet that Wagner's activities are explicitly tied to quid pro quo to the migration issue. But I certainly wouldn't rule it out if there are more problems between Niger and the Europeans. That don't mean that migration could be unregulated.
Thank you. We received 3 questions, 2 signed by those who sent them, and 1 is anonymous. Let me to start from the first one, and I will ask anybody, to voluntarily from the speaker side to reply in a short way. The first one comes as: what do you think of medium 5 years policy given KGB Russia will not win in Ukraine, but will remain strong in Africa? And what can the European Union, European Parliament in particular, do today to counter this militarily, or disinformation, or by diplomatic means? Who would be the first one to reply? What kind of EU response you would suggest? Anybody? May I ask Karen to step in? Karen, what kind of the EU action you would project?
I think, Dmytro, you had a hand up. Would you want to answer this question, or I can go?
Karen, you start, and Dmytro will follow.
Okay, perfect. So I think it's a bit of a difficult question, because there are many things that should and could be done in terms of countering influence. So, but I would say, if I should say one thing about how to best counter Russian influence, and perhaps especially in various African countries, I would suggest to see this influence maybe as more than Russian influence, or see that Russia has actually been able to take a position, or the Wagner Group has been able to claim a position, take a position, because there has also been sort of an African-led critique of EU countries, liberal states, sort of, and that interventionism. So I would say that of course there's a lot of disinformation on the African continent, especially coming from the Wagner Group in Russia. But I would just say that this disinformation also, it sticks better in some climates than in others, right? So my sort of overall sort of frame, and that's of course a lot easier said than done, would be to understand where this is coming from. So where's the dissatisfaction with European countries, with liberal actors? Where is it coming from? And to try to understand it better, instead of disregarding it as Russian disinformation only. And I say a first step in that is actually approaching African states as equal partners, as completely equal partners, and listen to what they have to say about, also about why they are critical towards Western or European countries.
Thank you, Karen. Anybody else wants to present his or her opinion? So, if not, Antti, it was William's question. The second one comes from Antti. Russian mercenaries and now the Russian MOD has nothing to offer to African countries in a long term. What would be the preferable actions for the European Union to promote liberal development there and offer a tangible alternative to the Russian influence? Samuel, probably you are the best to reply in a short way.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that, it's going to be quite difficult, even though the Wagner Group is floundering, to really change and roll back what they've done in terms of degrading democracy and degrading governance in the countries where they actually operate, because we're seeing the countries where they're actually operating going in a pretty negative direction. I mean, obviously in Libya, there's no real prospects of elections anytime soon, and Khalifa Haftar will most likely try, or through one of his allies, or through his son, or through some other proxy, to interfere and to participate in those elections, and likely rely on undemocratic Russian support in doing so. In Sudan, obviously, the transition has been scuppered and we're on a state of ongoing civil war. It was interesting that Hemeti did make some kind of diplomatic overtures towards Burhan about federalization, talking about some other policies after Prigozhin's death. Maybe he was afraid that the surface-to-air missiles wouldn't come because the Russian MFA and the Russian MOD don't like him, but the war is still continuing there. Mali's junta just canceled the elections that were going to be held in February. We're seeing in Central African Republic a term extension referendum, which Wagner actually helped back and secure. So he's going to be running for a third term again in 2025. So there's the very, very negative outlook in the countries where Wagner actually operates. But I think that this is a golden opportunity to show the risks and the costs associated with Wagner in countries that they might be targeting. In particular, countries in the Gulf of Guinea and countries in Central Africa, where they're trying to expand their reach and expand their horizons. So there's a risk of sanctions, risk of war crimes and civilian casualties, failed counterterrorism operations, and now a turf war coming out of Russia. So our focus should really be much more on preemption than on rolling back where they already are, and also really investing a lot more in the information sphere and also in the media sphere, because when there's a vacuum of Western narratives or productive Western thinking and Western ideas, Russia can kind of come in and stoke the autocrats and the anti-democratic elements quite easily, like we just saw happening inside the Nigerian theater. So I think also showcasing what Wagner has done in some of the countries where it operates to countries where they might be trying to expand to, like they were trying to look into expanding into Cote d'Ivoire, they're trying to expand into Sierra Leone. That would be quite helpful to do.
Thank you, Samuel. And the last question, which I would probably ask to reply from Dmytro's side, are there any doubts about Prigozhin and Utkin being liquidated by the Putin regime? Could it have been done by any other party? Dmytro, which opinion you would sustain?
In my humble opinion, there is no any doubts about who has committed this assassination. I would only rephrase this question in terms of why Vladimir Putin firstly made a decision to forgive, like kind of forgive Yevgeny Prigozhin, and changed his mind in 2 months, because with these 2 months he created a vulnerability for himself. I mean, political vulnerability, and showed the weaknesses that he has not punished Prigozhin at a time, right after he committed a crime. But I have a kind of conspiracy theory. The Il-76 cargo plane that belongs to the Ministry of Emergency, which is being ran by Alexander Kurenkov. Alexander Kurenkov is also the personal bodyguard, a former personal bodyguard of Vladimir Putin, as Alexei Dumin, who is governor of Tula. Alexander Kurenkov is the Minister of Emergency, and this cargo plane that was controlled by him, it went to Mali for around like 8 or 10 flights since June 24th, after the coup of Prigozhin. And after he finished these flights, Prigozhin was assassinated. So my question is, what was the cargo of this plane from Mali to Russia? Because it was a flight from Mali to Russia in like 8 or 10 times. In my humble opinion, it might be some, well, maybe metals, jewelry, or anything, which was obviously could be controlled by people on the ground in Africa. And when they got full control on all the potential as physical assets, so there was a decision why Prigozhin should be assassinated in the next day. Thank you. Thank you.
So we had all the questions. Now we have a request from Denis Kazakevich, who represents Charter 97, Belarus opposition organization settled in Warsaw. Denis, you have up to 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. It is a very important discussion. I just wanted to bring a bit more on the Belarusian dimension. So, although Prigozhin is no more, the threat from Wagner fighters remain, and the labeling of the, how you call them, they may vary, but we may say with high degree of certainty that at least some of those mercenary, of those professionals who know how to kill, they remain in Belarus. So the threat remains. I'm not sure about the inner workings of what's going on between Lukashenko and Putin, but what is clear that these fighters do remain in the countries, and now it is not yet decided, it is my understanding as of today, it is not yet decided their future. It's not entirely been decided. Like, now they try to find out the ways, answer to the question of governance and the question of financing. So, and although it's not clear exactly, but the ambition of Lukashenko, it's very clear. And the ambition of Lukashenko is to have his own kind of semi-private group of those commandos, so we can call them by different names. So that is something to pay attention to, and which kind of the threat remains, and maybe to add which kind of threat I'm talking about. So obviously it's not a big military unit, but there are possibilities for some sabotage or some minor incursions at the border. So it is a real possibility that something. It is the thing that should be treated very seriously. And what is certain, this requires some reaction, and there are different options. And I would repeat here the call of Ms. Natalia Radina, editor-in-chief of Charter 97, is that all trade with Lukashenko regime should be stopped, and all transit through the Lukashenko, contraband hub should be stopped, at least for a time being, and that would reduce this threat significantly. There is a quick and effective way to solve this threat to the EU border, and even to talk about that, it would already, alleviate the situation. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Denis. Time is up, ladies and gentlemen, and let me, on my behalf, to thank you, Hanna Liubakova, Samuel Ramani, Dmytro Zolotukhin, as well as Karen Larsen, for excellent presentations, as well as replies to the and discussion on this issue. I'm very thankful for you. You found the time to join and interest to share your thoughts about this important issue. We might be back on this issue at a later stage, and I hope you will join us again. And now I invite Anna Fotyga to make a very final remark from her side. Anna.
Thank you, Petras. Dear distinguished panelists, I'd like to thank all of you for very valuable contribution to this important conference. I feel that we need more space and possibilities here in the European Parliament also to broaden some aspects of Wagner Group's presence, policies, so we can promise you and our audience that this topic is to remain in our not only thoughts but actions at the level of Parliament. My special thanks to Denis Kazakiewicz for his very valuable contribution and bringing topic once more to Belarusian issue. Be sure Belarus is quite important among all MEPs. We, together with myself and Petras, we are very much focused on developments in Belarus, and in particular to ensure the raising power of the opposition, democratic opposition of Belarus vis-a-vis very atrocious and although in some respects weak Lukashenko regime, but still being able to really impose enormous violence against in particular society of Belarus, that is against this regime, that is opposing war of aggression perpetrated by Russia on Ukraine, and Russia's trying to drag Belarus also in the same war. So we are aware we want to continue these deliberations, but now thank you for today.
Thank you, Anna. I thank you all who made this online debate possible, especially people from our support team and so on. I thank you once again, all speakers, all participants, all those who have presented questions and interventions. I wish you a very nice day and see you next time. Goodbye then.